Hi and welcome to another episode of PDA Dad UK. Had a couple of weeks off just over the Easter holidays, but we're back and ready to go. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at schemas and toddlerisms. The reason I'm going to bring this up is that I get a lot of questions on my group on Facebook where people are concerned their kids may be autistic, usually at a very young age, sort of around 1.5 to sort of 3.5. And they see behaviours and they're concerned that it may be related to autism. This isn't always the case, and we do have these things called schemas. So I'm going to explain what schemas are, and we're going to go into a bit of detail about how schemas work, how they relate to autism, and also how they relate to just general toddlerisms, as I call them, which is the basic process of growing up and learning. So let's get on with it. What is a schema? So a schema is almost a patterned behaviour. So a great example is, we all use schemas. So schemas are used throughout our lives. We all have schemas that we understand, and a very basic precept. The idea of coming down and making your coffee or your tea in the morning is a schema. You'll likely have a process to it. You'll get the cup out, you'll get the tea bag ready, you'll put the kettle on, fill it with water, put it on the base or plug it in or whatever you do with your particular kettle. Let it boil, and then you'll add the water to the tea and then likely put a dab of milk and maybe add some sugar or something like that, depending on how you like your tea or coffee. That in itself is a schema. It's a pattern of behaviour that establishes something. But it goes much deeper. Schemas go into belief systems as well. We can have correct schemas and we can have incorrect schemas, if you like. So a correct schema may be that the world is round, despite what some people will argue. I'm Australian, so I've got a fair understanding that there is another side to the world, but it's round. I haven't fallen off when I came to when I lived there, and when I came to the UK, I definitely flew around. I didn't go over a lip at the edge and come back this way. We are definitely not a flat earth. That's beside the point, I'm getting distracted, but that's an incorrect schema. So it's a belief system that's based on something that's incorrect, and we usually adapt our schemas as we learn. So a really good example of adapting a schema is the understanding of how a ball works. So I may get a basketball and I'll bounce it and it'll bounce back up to me. So I then try it with a tennis ball. I'll throw that down and it bounces back up. So my schema developing is that all balls will bounce. This is not correct, because if I then go and make a ball out of Play-Doh and I throw that on the ground, it's just going to go and stick. So then I'm going to update my schema, and my schema may be along the lines of any ball that if I squeeze it returns to its original shape is going to bounce back to me. Any ball that remains as I've manipulated it, so if I squash it, it will stay as squashed, like Play-Doh, is not going to bounce back to me. These are really good examples of how we adapt our schemas. So we adapt our schemas to the world around us and to our understanding of the world around us. As we learn, as we develop, our schemas develop with it. We all have them, whether we're aware of it or not. Something as simple as turning on a light switch is a form of a schema. Schemas are a big part of toddler play. So when you're young and as a toddler, you learn things through schemas very commonly. My son, who is neurotypical, had a very interesting schema that was a boxing schema. He had a process he was going through for quite some time where he was just putting things in boxes and taking them out again. And what that is doing is his brain is simply learning the pattern of putting things in boxes, taking it out, how the box works. It's just a developmental part of learning, and schemas are extremely common in toddlers. Another example of a schema that may be an incorrect schema is often comes along with prejudice and even bigotry, where we have a belief system that isn't accurate. So if somebody is deeply racist, they are going to be deeply racist because they've had that schema established through their being raised or things that they've learned, misconceptions they've placed. And it brings into a problem that can occur with schemas. And that is, if we have a really deep set schema, it can be very hard to shift it and to take on new information and to adapt our schemas once a belief system's in place, once that schema's set, they can be quite rigid. And so as, functioning adults, we generally learn to adapt our schemas. As I said with the ball, I realise that if it's malleable and it won't retain its shape once I squeeze it, it's not going to bounce. I'm updating my schema and I'm learning from it. And I'm adapting it so that my world reality meets up with fact and scientific research or testing or whatever you like, the things that I've done to ensure that my schema is correct, and just adapting as I learn. So, driving a car, a lot of schemas involve driving a car because they're automatic things that we do. If we've got a manual particularly, you've got the clutch, you've got the gears, you know your speeds, you know how many revs you need to be at before you're going to shift gear. You know if a hill is a certain incline, you're probably going to have to go down a gear or two in order to climb it so that the engine can cope. All these things are schemas that are taking place. Now, my daughter had a number of schemas when she was growing up. Now, of course, my daughter is autistic. She has pathological demand avoidance, which is part of the autistic spectrum. She has ADHD and sensory processing disorder. And they're all ways that schemas have sort of not quite gone as they should, if you like. So a great schema that my daughter used to have is a surrounding schema. She has it to this day. So her schema was that she always used to place toys around her. It was her nursery that alerted us to it and said, hey, she's got this surrounding schema. Now, it wasn't a concern at that point. It's not something that we needed to do anything about because, as I say, it's part of learning. But she would have a thing where all toys, cuddly toys, whatever toy, they would go in a circle around her. So you often hear about a lot of autistic people, or some autistic people, will have things where they line up toys and stuff like that. Funnily enough, my son loves lining up toys. But as I say, he's neurotypical. We've got no evidence of any neurodiversity there. So yeah, my daughter used to line up the toys around her so they surrounded her. And she does this now. When she goes to bed, she has an unbelievable amount of bedding. And part of it is that she needs to feel really cocooned. So when you see her in bed, she's got like duvets she lies on that she sort of ruffles up beside her, along with pillows. And she's got like a stack of pillows behind her, but she'll only really be using one. The rest are just there for some kind of comfort, but it creates that wall, I suppose. And she'll have others that are around her as well. And then she has a duvet over her, and a duvet has to be a very specific duvet, the teddy bear quilting, because that's what she finds comfortable, part of the sensory processing disorder. But that's a schema in play, and it's a schema that she really just requires for her own comfort. So somehow her schema in her mind has switched from this is a nice comfortable thing to something I need. And that can be where these things cross over. I bring all this up because, as I said before, we get a lot of questions on my group on Facebook with parents who are concerned that their kids may be autistic. And they'll have usually observed certain behaviours, and often these things come into the realm of schemas and toddlerisms. So toddlerisms is a little phrase that I've coined. Basically, the things that we typically do as toddlers. There's a big crossover between autism and toddlerisms. So as I say, schemas really feature in that. They can be misinterpreted. There's a particular awareness, I guess, if you've had a child already who's on the autistic spectrum, you are then hyper aware, I guess, to certain behaviours and traits that may indicate autism in itself. Now, there's value to this. There is actually statistical evidence that shows that if you have an autistic sibling, the chances of you being autistic yourself are 48% greater. So for a kid being born into a family with an autistic child, there is a considerably higher chance that they will be autistic also. But it's not necessarily the case. As I say, my daughter, born autistic, my son, neurotypical. The point is that we can see a lot of things in our kids that we may interpret as being autistic traits or autistic behaviours that might not be, that can be part of the learning process. It's very difficult. There's a reason why most professionals won't diagnose until a child's at least 5, usually 7 in the UK. There seems to be this figure that they like. And there's actually good reason for that. Now, I'm not advocating that there shouldn't be early diagnosis for autism. If, the earlier that we can be on top of these things, have an understanding and be learning and implementing strategies and ways to work with our kids to help them and support them with their neurodiversity, that's a brilliant thing. And the bit sooner it happens, the better. And, you know, my daughter's now 10, coming up to 11, and we're only just getting on to actually having official diagnosis in place, even though everybody who works with her knows she's definitely autistic. We know she's autistic. Everybody who's met her knows there's certainly neurodiversity there and some more going on for her and more anxieties. So, you know, early diagnosis is a really good thing, but we do have to be cautious with how we approach that. And we can worry ourselves. I think sometimes, and it comes back to probably a misunderstanding of autism, that there's something wrong. And that's not necessarily the case. There are certain aspects that can come along with autism that need more support and more understanding and different strategies for raising our kids with these neurodiversities. So for my daughter in particular, if you're dealing with pathological demand avoidance, you have to change your parenting style altogether, because traditional parenting techniques just don't work. You have to learn to reframe to give the illusion of control. We've gone through this in previous videos and the ways that we have to help my daughter to understand the world around her and to function within it without melting down really fast. It's a really important facet of her neurodiversity, of having pathological demand avoidance, that we need to adapt our parenting to. And that in itself is adapting a schema. So our parenting styles come back to schemas. We may have a schema that says that, okay, child has done something we perceive to be wrong. Child needs to receive some form of consequence. So we might say that's going to be the naughty step. So what we consider to be naughty behaviour, consequence is naughty step for 3 minutes. Now with my daughter that won't work, partly because she may not have understood that what she did was wrong. She may not be able to help her actions. So if she's in meltdown, it appears to be a really strong tantrum. And you could think that's just completely unacceptable, but you've got to understand that actually no, this is part of her neurodiversity, it's part of her pathological demand avoidance. We have to work with it and accept it in some ways. We can't, it gets very complicated because you can't always, you know, obviously you can't just lash out whenever something goes wrong. You have to instill, there are ways to deal with your anxieties and the way that you need to let them out. But obviously just telling her off and making some the naughty step is going to get nowhere. She's just going to get resentful and angry, and the chances of her actually sitting for more than 2 seconds on a step without being strapped there, which I would never do, but yeah, without her being strapped there is just, it's not going to happen. So we have to find other ways to bring in consequences that she understands, but that are modifying her behaviour to be safe around others. So it's an interesting part of the process, but that's a shift in schema that I've had to make. And so kids will learn by these schemas, and they'll do lots of things, and it's part of the process of learning. So schemas are actually a part of the process of understanding the world around us. It's testing things. It's almost scientific, if you like. So kids may take toys apart. Lego's great for schemas because if you've got a destructive, deconstructive, I think they call it, schema, where you're pulling things apart all the time, Lego's great because you can pull it apart and it goes back together, and that's a big part of it. Richard Hammond from the Grand Tour and used to be on Top Gear, when he had his brain injury, so he was in a really nasty car accident where he was in a jet car and it flipped, and he had to go through a complete rehabilitation process because he had a brain injury. And in his book, he talks about the fact that Lego was a really helpful part of that. And it happened quite accidentally. Somebody had bought him a Lego kit or something, I think as a joke, but he'd started putting it together, and suddenly Lego became a big thing for him. And a big part of his rehabilitation was using Lego and making things from Lego, and it somehow wired his brain back to how it needed to function. Really, really interesting stuff. A really interesting book if you ever get a chance to read it, whether you're a fan of the Top Gear and Grand Tour stuff or not. It's a really interesting read, purely from the you know, what he went through with that accident and how he came to understand how his brain works, which is just fascinating. So what are some common schemas? First of all, there is what's called a connecting schema, and this goes back to what we were talking about with Lego. It could be the constructing of tracks. So you might have a train set and it's about taking the track apart and putting it back together. Lego, as I say, is a huge one because you can construct things, deconstruct them, reconstruct them, change them. and there's just so many options there. But anything that is basically to do with joining things together, pulling them apart, deconstructing, reconstructing, constructing, anything like that would come under a connecting schema. Another one is orientation schemas. Now this is really interesting because my son has this hugely. He loves to swing on monkey bars and hang upside down. He'll often hang off my arm, and he loves to be upside down. You'll see him on the sofa. He just sits there and he watches TV upside down and stuff like that. And that's to do with orientation schema. Now, we've spoken in previous episodes. In fact, there's a playlist I've got which is all on sensory processing disorder. That comes back into the interoception and our vestibular senses. So do check that out if you're interested in finding out more about that. But it's about learning our place in time and space around us, I suppose. So that schema is about learning your dexterity. It's about learning your relationship to the world around you and how you can manipulate yourself within it. So that would be an orientation schema. Another one's a transportation schema, and this is where you'll see kids carrying things around. They may have a pram or a truck or something like that they like to put things in and move them about. That's down to being a transportation schema. And again, it's about learning the relationship between moving things about. Now that can play into how we learn from our schemas. So sending, let's say you've got a picture that your child wants to send to Nana. So my daughter often takes photographs and wants to send them to Nana through Messenger. Understanding the idea of moving things from one place to another can come from that simple transportation schema. Learning that you're putting it into something, it's then moving over here and you take it back out again. It's not dissimilar to getting a photo from your phone, putting it onto Messenger, hitting send, and it appears at the other end and they can then download it. It all comes in the same realm of understanding. And so the schema of transport has helped to understand how an email or a message works with an image attached. Trajectory is a really interesting one because I think every parent goes through this one at some point when they watch their kids eating. So the idea that, we used to get it with both my kids. They're in the high chair, you give them the meal and poof, straight it goes down onto the floor. You're like, what do you do? You get to go, don't do it this time. Poof, it goes on the floor. The whole shooting match. That's a trajectory schema in action. It's basically understanding. It's, coming to terms with gravity and how things work. Again, the schema is teaching us about the world around us. So positioning schemas are another one. And we've already really talked about this, the idea of my daughter having this surrounding schema, they call it, but it's really a positioning schema. Having to have these toys or something surrounding her all the time. She loves enclosed spaces, stuff like that. For my son, he does love to line his toys up. He'll get all his trucks and he'll line them all up, all his Hot Wheels, and they all sit there in a line and he loves it. And it's just a part of that. That is simply a positioning schema. The positioning schema really feeds into what they call the enveloping schema, and this is what my daughter does. So this is the having to surround herself. So if your kids like dens, if they like building dens, if they like enclosed spaces, my daughter loves building dens. It's the bane of my existence. If she's got up early and I come down and there's just sheets and duvets and clothes racks all lined up in a way that makes this den in the living room. You can't see the TV because it's just the way it is, I suppose. But then you've got to have the drama of having to pull it apart and what comes from that. But that is an enveloping schema, and it really, really obviously relates to that sort of positioning schema moving into more personal space. So where the positioning schema is about the things that are around you, the enveloping schema is your place within that. And that again leads on to the enclosing schema. So it's taking it to the next level. So weighted blankets are often used with autistic kids and autistic adults that need to be surrounded, enveloped, enclosed is a big thing, and it's a part of normal childhood as well. Obviously, kids love to be hugged. They need that evidence of how much more emotionally secure a child is for having had received a lot of love and hugs and attention as a child is well documented. And so that need for compression is part of the enclosing schema. The last of the most common schemas, I would say, is the rotation schema. So a rotation schema is, and I remember doing this as a kid myself, when you have a kid who rolls down a hill or twirls around. So we see a lot of this in, again, it's very common autistic behaviours. Stimming often involves rotation in some way or another. And this is why schemas can get so blurred, I guess, into autism. Autism features schemas heavily, but all people have schemas. And that's where this understanding needs to come in, and why we don't need to probably stress or worry so much when we're watching our kids doing things that we may interpret as being potentially autistic behaviours or traits. They often simply schemas is part of the learning process, and we grow out of them, we move on, we adapt them to our world as we learn. And it's all part of that understanding and learning process. Really important to understand that. Difficult sometimes. And as I say, especially if you've already got autism within the family, it can become something that we can become hyper aware of. We start seeing things, and we were certainly, when my son was born, having experienced what we experienced with my daughter and learning about autism, you start to see things and think, oh, is that, is that something I need to be concerned about, or is it something I need to address? So that certainly comes into play, and it's perfectly natural. You don't need to feel guilty for feeling these things. But I do think that understanding, and sometimes it's about taking a step back and, almost taking an outside perspective, walking out the door and looking in through the window rather than being in the room. Being able to do that mentally and assess what's really taking place. Is this simply a learning process? Is it simply a schema? Or is it something that is leading to potentially being an autistic person? In which case, do we look at things like diagnosis? How can I support my child more? What adaptations do I need to make? And I had that in reverse, because we'd had to learn parenting from the perspective of raising my daughter. My son's 5 years younger than my daughter, so in that time we had some very cemented schemas on how we parent. However, and it was actually a friend who's a teacher, and she actually said to me, you've got to understand, you need to parent him differently. You're currently parenting him as you would parent your daughter. However, he has a greater capacity for rationalization when he's upset, so you can actually talk to him and he'll hear it. So we've talked in previous episodes a lot about the fact that anxiety and autism are sort of intrinsically linked. And when that anxiety peaks, that's when we get meltdowns. The problem is that when anxiety is in that stage, logic has gone for a walk. It's not around to interpret things. Whereas for my son, I can engage that logic more easily and bring him back down if he's getting upset or wound up. I've had to adapt my parenting to understand that my son is different from my daughter, and my approaches need to be different, which brings its own challenges, and we've certainly talked about that before as well. However, that's just the way it is. That's what we have to do. So schemas are really important. They're an important part of toddlerhood, learning about our place in the world. So schemas are often used to understand our role within things. So if we take the transportation schema as an example, taking something, placing it into the truck, moving it, taking it back out, that's the transportation schema in action. But I'm also understanding that my role in that is I have to load the truck. I then have to transport the truck. I then have to unload the truck. It doesn't just do it automatically and get there. And so these things become part of our understanding our role within the world around us. The orientation schemas are a huge thing, rotation schemas and stuff like that. It's learning the role of our body in the space around us. It's so important. It's why kids love to roll around and do these things. They like to get dizzy. They're actually subconsciously learning about their bodies and the role our bodies have in the world around us and how we interact with the world. So how do you know the difference? The difficulty is you really often can't, which is again why I say a lot of professionals won't diagnose kids until a certain age, 5, 7, around that time. It's becoming more common now that kids are being diagnosed early on when there's really obvious traits. However, certainly the case for the majority of people is that you do get a diagnosis around 5 to 7 years, or even later in many, many cases, our own included. What I always recommend is, if you're concerned that there may be autistic traits and you want to be able to support your kid the best, so you're looking to see, is this autism, is to keep a daily diary. So I always say keep a daily diary, just have in there the time, the date and time, what trait you're observing or what schema you're observing, and what the outcome was. And just do it on your phone. There's, use the notes app on your phone or something like that. That's what I do. Well, I did when I was doing this. Just keeping a record there that I could just quickly fill in, spreadsheet, anything like that. Just allowed me to keep a record of what was taking place. And if I could establish patterns, it made a big difference when I was coming to see I am concerned about this. Schemas will generally adapt and you'll grow out of them and move to different schemas, or they just form part of your everyday life. As I say, coming down in the morning if it's dark and turning on a light switch, that's a schema. And it's just a functional schema that works in life. OCD is a good example of a schema that's gone to an extreme that it's not working properly. It's not functioning as it should. So you have to, you get the sort of repeated switching and stuff like that. Those are things that where the brain is misinterpreting or over-interpreting what needs to be done and acting in a way that's not necessarily healthy. So you establish the patterns by keeping a daily diary. And that way, if you then are continuing to be concerned, you see these patterns and they're happening too often. Things like stimming, if you're seeing it, the rotation, but it's becoming something they're doing consistently many times a day and it's gone on for longer than just a couple of months, then you may think, okay, that's something I need to address. These are really important things. And keeping that daily diary just allows us to reflect. And then we've also got something that we can present to professionals when we come to say, I am concerned that there's something more going on. Can we have a look at this? Can we have a look at autism? Can we have a look at what may be taking place? Is there a neurodiversity present in my child? How can I then support? Those things are there. Often video evidence can help. So it's just something that backs up what we've said. This is an example of the behaviour I'm talking about. It can be tricky, and don't ever put yourself in a situation where you're not addressing your child in order to capture a bit of video. However, when you come to presenting, you can say, here's the diary, here's the things, and you can see these ones are consistently happening. And, the great thing about using a spreadsheet is you can immediately organise it into the different schemas or traits or behaviours that you've seen. And so you can lump them together and say, we've seen a lot of this and it's happening this way. It's a really good way to do things. That's what I always recommend to people. It is tricky, and of course we're hyper aware, and I do firmly believe that parents are the best experts on their kids. And it's something I think gets missed in the professional sector a lot, is that parents are sort of almost seen as an annoyance. It really drives me nuts. So much gets blamed on parents, and it's how you're raising them, it's the job you're doing, it's all down to you. And we seem to go through all of that first before an actual neurodiversity is potentially addressed, and that's so wrong. This way you've got something that backs up that says, I'm not just talking out of my backside, I actually have an understanding here, I've spent time and I've been looking at these things, and there is a genuine concern. And so you have that listed, and it's just really simple, presentable evidence, and it helps you to make notes before you go into a meeting for diagnosis and stuff like that. So if you're going to meet with the PED, you can actually take this information in, and rather than it just be, I don't know about you, but I often struggle when I'm put on the spot and I have to think of something, that situation you get where you say, oh, this isn't fair, this happens all the time. Well, give me an example of when that happened, and you just can't remember. My mind goes walkies and I'm gone on, you know what I mean. I'm dreadful in argument. My wife wins every argument based on the fact that I'm just useless with that kind of stuff. But that's another subject. So do observe your kids, do take notes, do watch what's taking place, but also don't stress yourself. And I think this is the biggest thing. We can get so wrapped up in concern, especially if we've already got neurodiversity in the family. We can start seeing things that potentially aren't there. That's natural. You've got an experience, and your life is going to reflect that experience in how you react to certain things. And there's going to be a heightened awareness and a heightened concern about certain things. Best thing you can do is take that step outside the box and address it with an air of rationality. And as I say, take actions that are going to respond to that. So watching and also learning about the different schemas. If you're seeing something and you think this may be a schema, there's plenty of information online that you can just go to that just says, here's what to do in this situation, how you can interact with schemas, how you can encourage them, how you can form play time around schemas, how you can buy toys that will help with certain schemas. So, Lego being a great example once again. Do all these things, but don't let it weigh on you as something that's just a burden. Having an awareness of something is different from having it constantly concerning you and worrying you. That's only going to be bad for your health, mentally, physically, whatever. It's going to have an effect on you. Being able to take a step back and just engage our rational function in the brain and say, okay, I'm going to keep an eye on this, rather than, is it this? And then becoming almost panicked about it, which is natural. That's not a criticism of anybody who's reacted that way. I've done it myself. But it's so important to be able to take that step back and address it rationally, and then you're going to make better decisions about how to progress. That's all I really want to say on schemas and toddlerisms and early diagnosis. If you've got any examples of this yourself, if you've had to work through schemas, if you've been concerned about neurodiversity being present and then realised, no, actually this was just part of their learning process, please do chuck in the comments. The more information I get on this kind of stuff and the more feedback we get, it helps so many more people, and it's stuff I can incorporate into future videos and hopefully help more. Please do like this episode. Please do hit the subscribe button, and you'll ring that bell and you'll get notified of any new content I have coming up. Stay safe, and I will see you again on the next episode.